and welcome to another episode of Judge of Character. As always, I'm your host, Steve. You know, folks, sometimes I find myself with a dilemma. Sometimes I have to choose between two characters that are both fantastic, but both very similar. Case in point, Solid Snake and Big Boss from the Metal Gear franchise. Both iconic characters in gaming, both soldiers, both simply awesome. But who to talk about? This was the quandary I found myself in, and after a few moments of deliberation, I decided upon the only logical course of action. Do both! So sit back and relax, ladies and gentlemen, because this is going to be a two-parter, and tonight we're going to start with the main character of the entire series, Solid Snake. Now, before I can actually talk about the character, I have to talk about the franchise itself so that you can understand any of what follows. Unfortunately, understanding the Metal Gear series is a challenge in and of itself. The franchise is made of many things, but simplicity isn't one of them.
I hear it's amazing when the famous purple stuffed worm in Flapjaw Space with the tuning fork does a raw blink on Harry Carey Rock. I need scissors. 61.
See? Now, many of you probably believe that the very first game in the series is Metal Gear Solid, as this was most likely the very first Metal Gear game you played. Well, you're wrong. The first Metal Gear game was actually Metal Gear, which was released in 1987 for the MSX2 computer in Japan and parts of Europe, and was created by modern gaming god Hideo Kojima. Unlike other games at the time, which had you basically blasting around the screen as a souped-up version of Rambo, you were forced to run and hide from enemies. The game was based on stealth and infiltration. You weren't supposed to fight your enemies head-on, you were supposed to avoid them in order to complete your goals. If you were discovered, reinforcements would be brought in, and you'd find yourself dead in no time. Now, the original game had some flaws, mainly in the control scheme, but overall it was a well-received game. Well-received enough that it got a sequel. A sequel so fucking bad that it warranted the release of a second, more true sequel headed by Hideo Kojima. That first sequel doesn't count, and we will not speak of it again. The game was followed by Metal Gear 2, Solid Snake, and it was here the standard of all future Metal Gear games would be established. Gripping storylines, well-written characters, and fantastic gameplay were all elements that were born here. Too bad you couldn't play it if you were an American. The game wouldn't be released outside of Japan until 2004, when there was a version for mobile phones. And if you wanted to play it on your TV screen, you had to wait until the next year, when it would be released as part of Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence, an expanded version of Snake Eater. This was then followed by the game that everyone knows. Do I even need to mention the title? Released in 1998, Metal Gear Solid is the third title in the MGS franchise and is considered by many to be one of the most well-known, groundbreaking video games ever. While the stealth mechanic had been used before, it wasn't until MGS was released that the concept took off, leading to games like Splinter Cell and Tenchu. The game was also groundbreaking in that, at times, you felt like you were watching a whole movie instead of playing a game, with fully realized characters. This was the game that gave us the iconic version of Solid Snake, the stoic soldier who was there to do a job and kick ass. Now, I could go into greater detail about the games and the storylines, but if we did that, we'd be here all day. And besides, you're going to learn more about the story as we learn more about what makes Solid Snake a memorable character. So, let's not waste any more time, let's get right into it. Arguably, the most common reason listed for the iconic status is his being a badass. I know, every other character I talk about in this show is some sort of badass. I can't help it if that's a common trait for memorable characters. The difference here is that Snake is a soldier, a Black Ops soldier at that, so his being a badass comes with the territory. But what separates Snake from other soldiers is the sheer insanity that he's had to face. I mean, how many soldiers do you know that can take on a tank armed only with a few grenades? You know, I'm beginning to think the Army got its Army of One slogan after someone at the Pentagon played this game a little too much. When comparing Snake's legacy as a soldier, there's no shortage of proof that the man is filled with pure, undiluted bad fucking ass. But as I've said before, badassery alone does not a character make. Thankfully, there's more to Snake's personality than just being a badass. In fact, when it comes to his personality, Snake's actually got a lot to offer. Despite the initial appearance of a cynical and jaded individual, Snake is actually a very kind and caring person. Well, at least later on he is. He often shows compassion for his allies and has been shown to have a healthy amount of respect for his enemies. In addition, Snake is both very intelligent and philosophical. Of course, with an IQ of 180, this is no surprise.
Overall, Snake is an interesting individual. One minute he can be chatting with you about the horrors of war and how they affect all of us, and then the next minute he can be choking you to death before slipping off into the darkness. Charming fellow.
But easily the biggest aspect of the character, besides the aforementioned badassedness, is his personal story arc.
Now before I go any further, you have to realize that the overarching plot for the entire Metal Gear franchise spans several decades and involves numerous people. Solid Snake may be the central figure in all of this, but his involvement in the plot only takes up so much time. So this next section of the video is only going to focus on his involvement in the overall plot. Any major events that are revealed along the way are only because he's directly involved with them. Remember, we still have to cover Big Boss in the next episode, and he has his own interwoven plot to tell as well.
When Snake first appeared in the original Metal Gear, he was your standard soldier, nothing special. He was on a mission to infiltrate Outer Heaven and rescue his comrade, Gray Fox, while investigating a new weapon called Metal Gear, a giant bipedal tank capable of firing nukes from anywhere in the world. With support from his commanding officer, Big Boss, Snake manages to successfully sneak inside, only to learn the horrible truth. Big Boss is behind the whole thing, having gone rogue against the United States.
What the hell?
This is the first major point in Snake's story, and a very big part of his development as a character, as we later learn that Big Boss was essentially Snake's sole father figure. You guys have no idea just how funny the term father figure is going to get in a moment. With the betrayal of the person who was essentially his parent, Snake began to become more cynical, which was made even worse during the events of Metal Gear 2, which sees Snake once again fighting against both Big Boss and another Metal Gear. Only this time, Snake's close friend Gray Fox, who you may remember having to save in the first game, has now sided with Big Boss and is now fighting against Snake. And just to top it all off, Snake learns that Big Boss is in fact his father, right before he ends up killing him. Mindfuck much? By the time we see him again in Metal Gear Solid, Snake is a bitter soldier who doesn't give a damn about his country, the army, or anything to do with either of them. In fact, the only reason he ends up getting involved in the events of the game is because he's essentially blackmailed into it. There, Snake has to infiltrate Shadow Moses Island in order to put down a group of terrorists and, follow along, you know the words, stop Metal Gear. Are you seeing a pattern here yet? But wait, there's more surprises in store for our hero. In this game, we learn that Snake wasn't just the son of Big Boss, he was his clone. One of three, in fact, with another one of them conveniently named Liquid Snake, leading the terrorists on Shadow Moses. This is getting to be long-winded. Look, bottom line, Snake has had a hard life, and he has had to go through a lot of shit. Like, a metric fuck ton of shit. But it makes for one hell of a story, and, like it or not, it's one of the many reasons that Solid Snake has remained in the minds and hearts of gamers all over the world. And it also happens to lead to my next point, his determination. So Snake has had to deal with a lot of crap throughout the games, but despite everything that's happened, he's always managed to push on, succeeding in his missions. Easily the best example of this is in Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. Not just any scene, the entire friggin' game. Seriously, if you think the things I've described so far are bad, you'll be amazed at Metal Gear Solid 4. This game is easily the hardest game to play through, just on the basis of watching what happens. Long story short,
Too late.
Snake's genes, because he's a clone, are starting to wear down, leading to a case of, holy shit, I'm an old fart. And just to make things even better, the world is once again in danger, and guess who has to save it? Cue the iconic line.
I'm too old for this shit.
Thank you. Now the thing about the fourth game that highlights Snake's determination is that, despite all of the shit he goes through in this game, he still manages to complete his mission. I could point to several scenes, but the best one has to be the corridor, which occurs near the end of the game. Snake is on his last legs, his end goal in sight. The only thing standing between him and it is a hallway filled with microwave radiation. With no other option, Snake begins his final push forward. This scene, more than any other, really shows the level of grit and sheer willpower Snake has, in addition to showing how desperate the situation has become for his allies. On the bottom of the screen is Snake, slowly making his way forward, while the cinematic plays on the top, showing his friends in their respective battles, and losing. As you go further down, Snake loses more and more of his health and is eventually forced to crawl, pulling himself forward by his fingertips. All the while, you're furiously mashing the triangle button on your controller in a frenzy, trying to get Snake to the end. By the end, Snake is barely moving, and you're uttering a prayer to whatever deity you worship, begging them, don't let him die! The screen fades, and... Yeah, if that isn't the best example of both his force of will and his badassery, I'll eat my hat. So all of that is well and good, but there's one other thing that I think makes the character memorable. Timing. The 1990s was an important time in gaming. This was the era in which video games went from being just another time-wasting hobby for kids to a more mature medium in which to tell new and exciting stories that could be accessed by anyone. The leader in all this? The Sony PlayStation, which was released in 1994 in Japan before finding its way over here in 95. The late 90s was when we began to see a whole slew of games that were very different from their predecessors. While there were still games like Mario Bros., we were starting to see more advanced stories from various genres, whether it was horror or adventure. Metal Gear Solid was one of the first titles to more or less trumpet the arrival of more mature gaming, and while it wasn't the first game to ever have a complex plot, it was definitely one of the best. And when you combine this with awesome action and gameplay as well as fantastically written characters, easy to say Metal Gear Solid was fated to succeed. As for Solid Snake himself, well, he just happened to be in the right place at just the right time. There's no doubt in my mind that Solid Snake is truly one of the greatest video game characters of all time. Hell, he's one of the greatest characters, period. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. With the numerous awards he and the franchise has won, including all of the different polls in gaming magazines, it's as clear as day that Solid Snake is a shining example of a memorable character. So there. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope to see you next time when I cover the other side of the coin, the legendary soldier himself, Big Boss. I'm your host Steve, reminding all of you, stay in character.